you're watching that movie and you're calling your friends on the phone. It was a real phone. You're like, did you see Mario play? Holy shit!
Which is, what does retro gaming mean to you? How important is retro gaming in your life? When did you start gaming in the first place? So I figured, you know what, might as well just go around the panel, and I would love to kind of hear everybody's stories and where it all began for you guys and why you consider yourself a retro gamer.
For me, retro gaming, because again, I look at games in the way that I do now, besides entertainment. I look at them in the same way I do film, because I am a critic, I am a reviewer, and I write about games. I think all of us here, I probably, have had the most exposure to writing about games as opposed to just playing them. It's a thing that, again, some of my biggest inspirations were Siskel and Ebert, and the way that they look at film is the same way that I look at video games, both retro and current or modern games. And retro stuff is anything, again, in the past, anything that tickles our nostalgia, that's not current in as far as like being part of the zeitgeist of right now. So right now we're already in the state where PlayStation 2 is considered retro right now at this point. And the same thing also, even I would argue, or some people could argue, the Wii, because we're already like a generation or two away from it or getting to that point, for a lot of stuff. But I enjoy retro games. I think also, besides the nostalgia factor, is that games from back then that are considered retro are a lot more simplistic compared to the games that we have now in the modern day. I mean, we were talking before about how games are so, complex, and they could be really challenging and, to play even. A lot of games from back in the day, from the late 80s into the early 90s, and even right before the 2000s, I would argue, they're a lot more simple. They have a lot less steps or a lot less of a barrier to entry when it comes.
Oh, absolutely, man. That's you really hit the nail on the head with that. It's a lot of games back then you could just pick up and go. Now, that's not to say that every game was like that. There were plenty of challenging games back in the day.
Oh man, there were well, and for me, retro gaming, I mean, for me is the stuff I played as a child, right? And that goes back to the Atari 2600. That goes back to when Nintendo first came out, and you were seeing who on the block had it because it was new, and that was the era of video games melt your brain, right, and make you an awful person, right? And so, but some of these games like were really hard, like really hard for children. So it's, I mean, there were games that you played for months and months and months. That was my introduction into strategy games.
Obsession, which console did you start on? When did your journey begin?
We had an Atari as long as I can remember. Well, in our Atari, we didn't have the cable, the cable jack, right? It was the bunny ears attachment,
right? The RF switch.
Yeah, the RF switch. So it was, like I said, it was a different time, and
channel 3 and channel 4 for a lot of people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Some of the early games, I mean, the 2-player games were fun, but some of the harder games were single player. And on 2600, that was it.
The Atari 2600 was my first console. That's where I started. I remember just playing countless games of Asteroids with my father and just everything. That's Space Invaders, Missile Command, Millipede. Oh, we.
You know,
Well, and I mean,
you know what's like really funny about this is because you guys say that as your first console. That wasn't my first console. I actually got the Atari 2600 later because my parents and my older brother owned one, and he had a vast collection of cartridges. And I got exposed to all those classics, and ones that I came to learn later on were classics. But my first console was Sega Genesis. It was with Sonic the Hedgehog in. So I was a 16-bit Sega kid back in the day, but I still got exposed to that 2600 era of games.
Oh, and then you got into Nintendo, and we had a Nintendo probably late 80s when we got our Nintendo. But yeah, it was a 2600 for me.
Let me ask you, did you guys at any point, like during school, because again, you guys are older than me, so you probably were in middle or high school at one point, like during around the time when these like things were relevant, but like IBM computers, like on Apple IIs, because I played a lot of those games like as educational games when I was in elementary school, as I was playing like Number Munchers, Where in the World's Carmen Sandiego, a lot of stuff, Mask of Zorro or Mark of Zorro, like a lot of stuff like that is how I got exposed to that, but it wasn't even that I owned it. It's just that, again, at the school, they had the computer lab. We used to go there every once in a while, like almost every other day. So
well, and our generation were the test subjects for that, because I remember the first time Number Munchers came out. I spent more time in the computer lab on that game. Oregon Trail, I died of dysentery probably 4 million
every time.
Numbers and stuff, and using the almanac for Carmen Sandiego.
Carmen Sandiego was probably one of my favorite games because it was hard and I was dumb. So it wasn't easy for me because I wasn't the sharpest crayon in the box.
And I was going through the top 5 of major Latino game characters or Hispanic game characters. But you have to know, Carmen Sandiego is technically, because I had to research this, I had to like quadruple check it. She's the first Latino or Latina/Hispanic woman character in games that's of significance that became a pop culture icon. And she doesn't get enough credit for that.
A lot of people don't even know it, to be honest.
Yeah, because you know who they give it to? They give it to Don Flamenco on the NES, and that's wrong because she actually predates that by a couple years.
Well, even still, I mean, even just the character of Carmen Sandiego doesn't have the following that it should, because that game after our generation kind of lost hold.
Because it's an educational game. That's why a lot of people write off educational games.
Right. You know, Bert and Ernie's Bubble Bath Pipes was when I was like 5. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that.
What kind of game was that?
You just reminded me.
Connect the water. It's like these apps where you're like connecting the water pipes, and Bert was Rubber Ducky was at the thing, and he was trying to get to his Rubber Ducky, and that was. But you know, I mean,
a whole string of games like that, especially on the Atari with Sesame Street and everything. Some were like math games. I had one that. Do you guys remember? Outside of the joystick, there was like a blue panel, like about the size of an iPad.
I've seen it, but I didn't have
all
that.
numbers.
The pad, right?
The pad, yeah.
The number pad,
you put an overlay in it. So I had that with a Big Bird game, and it was like an egg catch.
Yep. Yes.
There you go.
Computer.
Yes.
Oh,
that's it, bro. That's vintage right there. Floppy. And see, that's what people think of floppy. They don't think of 3.5s as floppies.
There was a game called was it Chip or Chip's Adventure or something? It was like a little thing you find keys and do math, and then
I loved that game.
I think it was Chip's Adventure.
I think it was Chip's Adventure.
My first computer game, somebody in California had wrote the program for Lunar Lander, and we played it on the TRS-80s. But my teacher had to send off to California, and they had to mail it to her.
Oh wow,
that's it. There was
took like a month to get it, but once she got it, man, we had to fight to play that game. That was so cool. Okay, for real now. Did you guys ever have disc wars in class with these?
Oh, we
throwing them at each other like a frisbee?
No.
Oh yeah.
I never did.
Oh yeah.
I didn't do that.
Got suspended for doing that.
The first time I almost poked somebody's eye out, I think, was one of those.
Oh yeah.
I just randomly threw it across the room trying to get in the trash can, and somebody stood up and it right across their face. I was like,
that's got some sharp corners too.
That's what I'm saying.
Combat. I mean, we were hiding behind the desk going pew pew. Then Tron comes out a couple years later, and we're like, "Whoa!"
I remember my transition from Atari to Nintendo to get into the 8-bit generation. I'll never forget this day. My brother and I were so in awe of what just came into the house. And then I don't think my brother and I actually got to play it for the first at least 6 hours because my father and my uncle were playing Duck Hunt like crazy.
That's funny. And then you get into movies that were reflective of this, and then you get stuff like The Wizard that was, I mean, basically the introduction. They used that movie to introduce a new game. Like that was so early, you know. I mean, games weren't getting trailers a lot. I mean, they were, but not that.
Yeah, they were getting commercials because that was the age of commercials.
But like, you weren't getting in movie. Like this whole movie was about gaming. And then you get to the end of it, and it's like, holy crap, there's a Mario 3. There's a Mario 3? Did you know there's a Mario 3? I didn't know. We gotta go. Right? Like you're breaking open your piggy banks because you saw Mario flying. You're like, Mario's flying!
Straight to Toys R Us right
Mario's flying! There's gambling. Get in here. I mean, this is what it was like, right? You're sitting in your room or in the family room, and you're watching that movie, and you're calling your friends on the phone. It was a real phone. You're like, "Did you see Mario flying? Holy shit!" Right?
Yeah, like, that's forever to dial too, because we had the rotary phone.
Yeah, because we had I mean, it was still rotary, or if you had the punch phones, right? But I mean, you were calling your bud. Did you see that shit?
that like whole time frame, like late 80s into the 90s, that was literally the age of commercials, like not just for like games but for toys, really. But you saw a lot of game commercials like on Saturday mornings, you know, after school and the weekdays and stuff. For us kids, and again for me, you know, growing up in the 16-bit era, that was really rampant for a lot.
I totally agree. The console war generation is something like some people tried to say it was sort of the same with PlayStation and Xbox.
No, it's not.
Like, no,
it's not. As someone that lived in the middle of it, no, it's not.
No, not even.
It was a different vibe. That was a time where it wasn't so combative with no matter what type of fan you were. Like there was always the debates, there was always the arguments and stuff, but it wasn't combative in the way that we see now in these console wars. Because back then, as someone that has done this, because I come from a family that wasn't rich to get multiple consoles like that, you would go to your friends' houses that had the other consoles. And that's how you would get exposed to the games. So when I first played the Super Nintendo, I went to a friend's house and I played Donkey Kong Country, Super Mario World, and other games like that for the first time. And I was fascinated by it. But also at the same time, even for people that I knew that had the same console as I did as a Sega Genesis, some of them might have the same console, but will have an entirely different lineup of games.
No, that's when that time came around, you know, I was very fortunate that my parents could get me a console, but I had to make a choice. It was, do you want a Genesis or do you want a Super Nintendo? And I chose the Genesis. And my cousin got a Super Nintendo. So that was, like you said, you go to somebody else's house and you experience the other game. And it would be vice versa. You'd invite everybody over to your place. It's like, all right, now we're
we did that all the time. All the time. Young kids.
I did that when I got the ColecoVision.
Like you guys were saying before, more commercialized at that point. And this was the era of mascots.
Yeah, that's very true. The early 90s all the way through the 90s, I would say, because that kept going until I even think in the 2000s with the PlayStation, even all the way through to PS2. Like it was a lot of different mascots representing different companies. And I think that there was also a lot of failed mascots because it was such a fad. There were different series and games that they wanted them to become a mascot so they would have the same similar features or presentation, but just wouldn't take off. Like it was very hard to compete with Mario and Sonic back then. And even I would argue Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah.
You know,
they set the standard.
Whereas back then you had Mario representing Nintendo and Sonic was representing Genesis, right? And that was basically it for a long time.
The thought of those two characters coming together in any way, shape, or form was impossible.
That was surreal at some point. That was like, because that was the end of an era when you really think about it. Because years prior to that, that would have been inconceivable. Because
there are a lot of these games that were one console or the other, and I feel like that's a big part of retro gaming. If you don't remember the times of only being able to get it one way or the other, that was a big part of growing up in the retro gaming era. Is that back then there was less cross pollination with the big gaming companies, right? So whoever's putting out Mario was exclusive, Sonic was exclusive, but then you had, you know, Street Fighter was exclusive to Super Nintendo for many years. You had to have a Super Nintendo if you wanted to play 2-player Street Fighter like you did in the arcades. And I think Genesis had Mortal Kombat, right?
No. The way it had it was that those games, specifically Mortal Kombat 1 and 2, came out on both, but they had it at different like months intervals, like different months delayed, like one would appear on one and the other. And with Street Fighter, it was with Capcom, where first I believe it came out on Super Nintendo, but then they had Champion Edition, or the Special Champion Edition, which was Hyper Fighting, that came with the 6-button controller for the Genesis, like, or at least, you know, they marketed it where you have to get the 6-button controller from Sega in order to play that the right way, like how it was, because all 6 buttons were laid out kind of like in an arcade.
Yep. And this was the generation too where we were finally like, we can get the games we played in the arcade in our home.
That was the whole marketing behind Genesis. Like literally, the Genesis specifically for a long time, especially during its launch, was made to specifically emulate the same type of games you got in the arcade brought to the home. And that was,
you know, Mortal Kombat, playing it like you are in the arcade. I mean, at the same time, that was the appeal to Super Nintendo, was you're playing Street Fighter like it was in the arcade. So you got used to the moves in the arcade, and then you took them home, and you're like, oh my God, these are the same moves. I'm gonna whoop your ass. Right? Like,
so the marketing for certain things that they did show and pull from, like obviously Genesis had the Michael Jackson game, Moonwalker, like that. And it was a big deal for them to get like, you know, stuff like that was in the pop culture that was resonating with the older crowd, for stuff like that to stand apart, to like really like, you know, make an impact.
Well, I believe I was advised the Sega does what Nintendo
don't.
Yeah. And that's where, you know, there was definitely that separation in the fandom, but like you guys said before, it wasn't like an aggressive like hate. You know, everybody met in the middle at some point.
It was the Jets and the Sharks. Let's just say it. Like, it literally was the Jets and the Sharks, because it was a war that you could go home afterwards and then come back the next day refreshed. Like, that's how it really was. It was like a Saturday morning cartoon.
Did you see Mario play? Holy shit! Right?
Yeah,
like they're calling your butt. Did you see that shit? These are the same moves. I'm gonna whoop your